off our masks. We promise we won't get near anybody else, and when it's time to disperse, we will put our masks back on. And the Writers House says that that's all right for us to do. I think we're comfortable with each other like this. And please feel free to keep your masks on or off. I think mask encouraged is the current policy here in this room. Welcome. We're just going to launch in. I can't believe we got started very close to 6 o'clock. I think this will go not too much more than an hour and 10 minutes, something like that. There will be room at the end for questions. That's always some of the best stuff anyway. And John will sign some books, and then there will be a reception, and you can elbow him rather than shake his hand. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Paul Hendrickson, and I've had a lot of guests I've been honored to participate with at Kelly Writers House, and tonight is right up toward the top because of my respect for John Freeman, whom I will more formally introduce in just a second. Can I please first, though, do what I always remind myself to do, and that is to thank the people here at Writers House who put on these programs. I participate in them once or twice a year, but week in, week out. And yes, the pandemic created a terrible psychic wound, you might say, in the body politic of Penn, and it's only in the last couple of months that live events have started up, but many virtual events took place during the pandemic, and I know what a great logistical feat it is to pull off these events. And they do it with such grace and aplomb. And this whole collective Writers House staff, I'm just very honored to have been able to work with all of you these years. Thank you so much. I see colleagues. Thank you. I see some colleagues here tonight from the writing program in the English department. I'm so pleased that you took time to come. My dear spouse of 43 years is here in the audience. A lawyer friend of mine is here. I've got a scarf on. What am I doing? I felt that around my neck suddenly. I'm like some Parisian artist or something. Excuse me. That was unscripted. The old students are here and current students. There's a student, I'll embarrass her, Susie Cook. She teaches at St. Joe's Prep, and she's brought some prepsters with her. And she holds the record because I think we worked together as prof and student 22 years ago, and here she is. So she's got the record. But I think Elaine is somewhere here in the audience, and she's up there too. So once again, we are privileged, aren't we, to gather in this little Victorian cottage set back from the walk. It was the residence of the chaplain at Penn, and I'm always comforted by that. It says in a book I used to know pretty well, in the beginning was the Word. I was a student once for the priesthood, and we prize the Word in here so much. And, the fact that we're in this place, in this little house, which you almost feel sometimes you could nest in the palm of your hand. It's so small and lovely compared to these monolithic buildings around here. What do we try to do? Well, it's part of the contribution of what it means to live at this time and place. And that's what the words that we struggle to put on the page. And when we get to be in the presence of an honored guest like John Freeman tonight, it's all the more powerful an experience. And I know for a fact that one or two people here tonight, this is their maiden voyage inside Kelly Writers House. For me, it's always been a North Star. So those of you who are welcoming yourselves back after the long pandemic, isn't it wonderful to be physically in this room again tonight? John Freeman. A couple of weeks ago when I started thumping the tub to get people to come out, I wrote a note to some colleagues and listservs around the university, and I said, in effect, the following. I said, it's almost easier to say what he is not, or at least hasn't been. Listen to this. He is a former president of the National Book Critics Circle. He is the former editor of Granta, which is that legendary British literary publication that I think got started in 1889. He is a founding editor of Literary Hub on the web, which to my mind is kind of the New Yorker on the web. So he's a founding editor of that, and it was served as an executive editor of it. He is founder of a literary annual called Freeman's. It's his own magazine of new writing. It comes out now once a year. Our late lamented Penn Book Center, not the university bookstore, but the Penn Book Center down on 34th, used to feature it always on the front rack. We mourn the loss of the Penn Book Center. John is an executive editor currently at Alfred A. Knopf, which, to my mind, is the most prestigious publisher in the United States. He is the author and editor of 10 books. He is a poet whose poems have appeared in the New Yorker and the Paris Review. He has been translated into over 20 languages. He is a writer in residence at NYU. At Knopf, which he joined almost exactly a year ago, one of his authors, Nadifa Mohammed, author of the novel The Fortune Men, got shortlisted for the 2021 Booker Prize. It goes on, but I dare say you get the drift. Another thing, though, and I think you will see it this evening, he is almost pathologically modest. In an often backbiting publishing world, he is extraordinarily kind and other-directed, and I am a direct beneficiary of that kindness and other-directedness. He is absurdly young, so I can only conclude that actually he is not one person, but some kind of multinational corporation disguised as one person. When I first tried to get him to come to Penn, he wrote back and said, true fact, Paul, I have a better idea. How about if I bring one of my authors and we can have a kind of round table? And I said, no, John, I want you to come to Penn, and Penn would want you to come. And he said, okay. So that's an abbreviated resume, so to speak. Would you welcome what I feel is one of the most distinguished and young literary figures in America, John Freeman. He will despise me for doing what I'm going to do next, but why not? I just embarrassed him right now. Wow. This is his last book of poetry. No, go back to the cover, Zach. We got a surprise here. I was talking about the wonderful people who do all the side stuff at Writer's House, and Zach Cardner is our ace audiovisual guy, and I asked him to take a picture of John's most recent book of poetry, and he has a new one coming out in the fall, The Park. I'll bet some of you know instantly what park that is. I bet you do. That's the Jardin du Luxembourg in Paris, isn't it? With those incredibly fine, pebbled walkways, those gravel paths, and those plane trees that go so vertically up, and they're just like soldiers. And the chairs. I remember when I first went to Paris, the little old ladies would come by and say, Monsieur, centime pour les chaises, s'il vous plaît, meaning they wanted you to rent the chairs for pennies. And there they are, the same kind of chairs that I remember from 50 or 60 years ago. John wrote this magnificent book of poetry called The Park. The Park. It's inspired by the Jardin du Luxembourg. It very much takes place inside the Jardin du Luxembourg, which I think is my favorite spot in Paris. My wife and I love to walk inside the jardin. But this book of poetry and the poems in it range far from the park. They can happen 10,000 miles away, but somehow the park always figures in. And there is almost reportage in this book of poems. I have a feeling that John was sitting in one of these chairs with the International Herald Tribune right here at his nose or over his eyes, watching what is happening on the next bench so he can go back to his flat and write a poem about it. And I know he's going to despise this, but Zach now. No, the other one, Zach. Let's go for John. Will you read, not the waltz, but first of all, the hand? Do you have there you go. There you go, Zach. This is just one of the poems from the park. He is such a modest man that there was no possible way I was going to tell him I was going to spring this on him. But would you read to us this? And the poems are so short. There's 2 and 3 words on a line. And follow along as he reads to us the hand. This is a father-son poem. I'm such a sucker for father-son poem. Read the hand.
I don't know why a poem looks a little bit like underwear when you see it after it's been published. You think, did I leave that outside? I should have put that away. This is called the hand. I recall the trick my father did. Disgorged his pocket, its magical keep. A nut, coins, a leaf, receipt, marble, cigarette butt. I could peek as long as I wished at the astonishing yard sale he kept in his pocket, as the girl does in the park today, prying open her father's fingers. To possess that capacity for surprise. June light shoots from her eyes. The girl's grandmother looks on with patience, recalling her late husband's hands, cracked, I imagine, like my father's, like her son's. She knows the girl won't ask, as I didn't ask, what the cracks were from.
As I said, I personally am a sucker for any father-son poem. I love the word, its magical keep. I couldn't have thought of that in 10 years. And then it comes right back in the park today. Oh, shut up, Paul. You're sounding like a teacher. Let them enjoy the poem, for God's sake. Yeah, that I said 10,000 miles. Well, one of the places John is from is Sacramento, California. So I imagine that his father disgorging his pocket with that keep, that magical keep, some of that might have happened in Sacramento. Let's do one more. Can we hear one more Freeman poem? Would you read to us? Now the waltz. Same thing. We're in the Jardin du Luxembourg, but we're somewhere else. We're some handsome young man with a cummerbund on is waltzing a girl somewhere. Let's.
It's so nice to have to be a human jukebox. No one's ever asked for these poems, and so over time, once a book comes out, you tend to read the same 5 poems. It's sort of like an album, you've got like 3 songs, and then there's that slow song on the rap album that no one listens to. So this might be that slow song. Tonight in the park, I was reminded of the first waltz I attended. Dancers turning across the floor in orchestration, lights low. The beauty of being young, trying not to be, in our dinner jackets and dresses, our parents' cars polished, parked outside, still ticking in the heat. Unaware this dance was a rehearsal. To what, it wasn't clear. Movement felt so free and endless, so much like the point around which the entire planet orbited, just as tonight people strolled in twos in Paris, picnicking in groups, laughing with their tongues, lounging on chairs together, waiting for a chance dip in light, like the lovers entwined near the empty kiosk, cooled by mists, set off every 10 minutes on timers. A hiss of water meant for many, but now it's just them in the deep green shade of the trees, those chaperones of love's necessary discretion. Eventually, it will be all of us turning out of a final cool night. We hope together, or in twos, but it may be alone. We need each other to face that fact, even on a night like this.
Maybe John would not pick that poem himself to read, but to me it speaks so much of what John is about. First of all, I just love the imagery, the deep green shade of the trees, but the way it ends up, how we need each other. The reason that I surprised John with this, I knew he would never go along with it if I asked him to do it, is because of the many, many things he is: an essayist, an editor, an anthologist, a literary critic, a teacher. It's my feeling that somewhere in the heart of his soul, John is a poet, and I love his poetry deeply. John, got a lot to ask you here, but I'm just curious, and we talk about this so much in the writing workshops, how a story arises. Where is the head of the stream that makes it bubble up and become the park? How did you come to the idea of writing a book of poems inspired by the Jardin de Luxembourg and going everywhere else?
Well, first, I want to thank you for that long and embarrassing introduction, and for the care that you've taken in thanking all the people that have put this event on. It's really nice to be here together. This is my second, I think, in-person event in 3 years. I've always wanted the Venetian blinds that did that in my house, like I was in some sort of super cool Joan Didion LA sort of Malibu pad, I too teach in a writing program, and it's a low residency program, which means people go to Paris. I know you can get your violins out, and then go home, and we correspond. And so the last 10 years or so, I've been going to Paris an absurd amount of time, and I've made friends with the people I rent from, and they have a beautiful, tiny apartment on this little street that runs up into the park called Rue Servandoni, which is where William Faulkner stayed when he went there in his 20s, taking his typewriter into the park. They have pictures of him sitting there. It's not exactly an Apple laptop, and he's sort of banging away. And the park became a kind of living piece of my mental ecology when I was there, because this was, especially after writing my first book, which was sort of prompted by, I think Paul describes, his own life writing seminary in some ways out of the failure of being a seminarian, and how rupture can kind of make you as a writer, and how his Marion post-Walcott book is sort of the key to his life as a writer, because it was the person who rescued him. And sometimes the thing that makes you a writer is the thing that subtracts the most from you. And so I wrote my first book of poems as my mother was dying, trying to conceive of the world without her. And after that, I was slightly worried. I thought,
that book is called Maps.
What if this is the only thing I have to say? Which is how surreal and strange it is when the person most important to you is absented. It's something all of us unfortunately have to go through. And so I was wandering around the park, and this was the beginning of the Trump presidency years, in this, sort of catastrophic government. And I thought, this is a terrible time to write poetry, because everything that you had to say publicly, or felt compelled to say publicly, or I did, was also obvious. Like people should have a right to human dignity, various things. And when you put that into a poem, you can, it doesn't sound very good. And so I started to try to look around the park and what was happening in the park, and look on geologic time in the park. And then the park started revealing itself to me. And so I started just sort of taking notes, and some of those became poems. And the poems that Paul asked me to just read now were probably midway through composing the poems that became the park. And the waltz poem was an easy one. My favorite times to be in the park were at the beginning of the day, when it was slightly empty, and the park as a natural, a piece of natural ecology, had its own intimacies and mysteries, and I felt like I had to kind of tiptoe in and be part of those in the most unobtrusive way. And then at the end of the day, when the light was basically taking the park back, when it was receding and this kind of beautiful rose-colored light would fall on it, and I was walking. I'm American, so I ran through the park too, sweating while everyone was sitting there with these umbrellas and doing that weird French thing where they make out for 3 hours slowly. I saw that a lot. I think that's an amazing feat of patience for everybody involved. And so I would come to the end of a run, and I'd know for sure the day that this came to me, and I thought, it's like the park is this amazing kind of clock, when you're in a waltz, and the waltzes are so orchestrated. That's some of the pleasure of the park that I found was its coherence and the coherence of its design. And people were sort of turning through the park, and it just instantly called back to me the first waltz that I went to in high school.
Yeah, the young John Freeman, with our parents' cars polished, parked outside, still ticking in the heat. He doesn't talk about a cummerbund, but I picture you so dashing and handsome, and with the most beautiful girl in Sacramento, going for that waltz that evening. If I can tell the quickest story, in the summer of 2019, so right before the plague happened to us all, my wife and I were in Paris, and I got an email, just popped into my box from John Freeman. We don't communicate that often. And he said, are you going to be in London this summer, maybe teaching the Orwell in London course? I said, no, because that had happened some years before, and we had a connection there. But I said, funny thing. I said, I'm in Europe right now. And the email came back, and he said, really, where? And I said, well, we're in Paris. And he said, so am I. And he said, where are you? And I said, well, we're right off Saint-Germain. And he said, so am I. We were about 20 feet from each other. I'm exaggerating, but the next day he was talking about Faulkner, the young Faulkner. We met at Hemingway's cafe when Hemingway was penniless, not the famous Paris cafes, but when Hemingway first went to Paris with Hadley in 1923, and they were just scrumbling for nickels wherever they could find them. And so we met at this beautiful little cafe, and we visited. And then afterward, we went back to this. My wife found this beautiful apartment. It was way past our what we should have rented, but it sure was beautiful. So I wanted to show it to John. And we were in this elevator going up to the apartment. We found ourselves quoting poetry to each other. So that's my memory of the last time I saw John. I want to move to something else. Even that poem had hints of it about how we need each other. John is all these things, as I said, a critic, an essayist, an anthologist, a teacher, a poet. Half a dozen years ago, he began putting together a series of anthology, the Tales anthology, I call them, Tales. The first one was Tales of Two Cities. It was about the terrible inequalities in New York City, the very, very rich, and 25,000 homeless children. The second one was this one, Tales of Two Americas. And he had what I feel is an absolutely brilliant idea that had been hiding in plain sight. From the back cover, America's broken. You don't need a fistful of statistics to know this. Visit any city. Well, we all know this. John's idea was, how can we get people to feel the experience of brokenness in America? And because he's a literary man, what he did was he got together some of the best novelists and short story writers and poets and a few journalists. He had this vision, and to make us feel what it is like. So in this book, Tales of Two America, Tales of Two Americas, there are contributions from Annie Dillard, Joyce Carol Oates, Ann Patchett, Sandra Cisneros, Kevin Young, who's a great poet, Chris Offutt. I mentioned Annie Dillard. Some of these were original contributions to this book, and others had appeared elsewhere, but John had the vision to bring them together. Annie Dillard wrote a 2-paragraph piece called Soup Kitchen. And it's about, if you can't write that day, you know what you can do? You can go to a soup kitchen. John, I know, and I was just describing, in a sense, how you were haunted. You were haunted to do something, this deep social conscience in you, but very specifically, and I know why, because you write about it in your beautiful introduction. Would you tell the audience what happened? It was a December night. You flew home to Sacramento. You put a light jacket on. You went out walking toward a bookstore. Take over.
I think one of the things I'm trying to write about a lot is that we all have multiple selves, and we exist in them at different stages and in different places. And so one of the things I think that's most compelling about reclaiming our togetherness is getting access to those various selves in our bodies. And for me, one of those has to do with being well and unwell. All of us have been unwell, and you feel like at some point, and even if it's minor, you think, I'm never going to get better. I'm never going to get better. And then suddenly it breaks. But you can also have this in your own family, as I do. I have a brother who I love very much, who's great, but he also struggles with mental health issues. So his life has gone very differently than mine. And I relate to him intensely and intimately, and I'm aware that in every place I go, that I could be a person sitting on a street by virtue of a different genetic makeup. And so what Paul's describing is I went on the road for Tales of Two New York Cities, which is the book about New York, which was prompted because I moved back to New York in the early 2010s, and my little brother was living in a homeless shelter, and I was living in a loft in Manhattan, and we were on the same block, separated by a few crosstown blocks. And that experience was a lot worse for him than it was for me, but it colored how I felt about traveling around America, because I suddenly saw that everywhere, not just New York City, had people living on the streets, and many more than ever before. And to function to some degree efficiently and swiftly, you had to just basically stop looking and turn yourself away from the levels of need around you. And so the night that he described in Sacramento, I was going to my hometown bookstore, and I was immediately stopped by someone asking for money, asking for change. And eventually I was stopped by someone who was asking for, the Meals on Wheels truck. And it just seemed pathologically on point that as I was touring a book about inequality sort of kept interrupting me. And I think it's a very difficult thing to write about class in America, because, there are we try to pretend like that doesn't exist. And I think the foundational myths, which are proving to be much more creaky than I think, at least they were admitted to be when I was growing up, that there's this idea that we can change our fate. And increasingly, all the numbers tell us that that's not possible. And the question is, how do we live in a country where that's the case, where if you're born poor, you're probably going to stay poor? If you end up with a catastrophic addiction, there's a strong chance it might kill you, or it will take everything. Or if a serious illness comes for your family and it runs out, your healthcare runs out, you might be bankrupt, which is the number one cause of bankruptcy. in America. And so I wanted to gather writers together collectively, because I don't think one person, there's no such thing as a solution to this, but there is such a thing as a form of regard, at least of seeing the problem to some degree, can make it possible to not to live with it and be okay with it, but to at least begin to start to operate in ways that are more ethical than turning away. And so that's why I put together the book, and that's why I believe very much in collaborative enterprises, because there was a writer in here named Sarah Smarsh, whose brother, she's the first in her family to go to college. She's a fourth generation Kansas kid who grew up on a farm, and her brother is the second in her family to go to college, but he can't get a job teaching at university, so he sells his blood plasma. And if you drive anywhere across the United States, in virtually every city you'll go, you'll find lots of blood plasma banks. And so she's written a beautiful essay about how many people profit off of his blood plasma, because it's not just him selling that. It means that he gets a card, that's facilitated by a major banking company that takes a certain amount of percentage of the money that he's been paid for his blood plasma. And it's the metaphors in some of these pieces are kind of they're beyond effective. They're slightly they demolish, I think, to some degree, the so-called solidity of the myths that need to be replaced.
But you see, I said a brilliant idea hiding in plain sight. There would be a lot of authors or a lot of editors out there who might have these same kinds of feelings, but John was actualized and activated to do something about it. And rather than give us sociological tracts, he said, no, I can make this happen by having our best poets and short story writers and novelists and a few journalists, as I said, tell us what it really feels like. Because he's so modest, I know I importuned him to read those poems. In this beautiful introduction, which launches this book, here's what he said about that night that he immediately got panhandled when he walked out of his home. People were coming up and asking for money. And John wrote, taken in isolation, their requests had a stark, brutal simplicity. They were each a call to basic kindness. Will you see me? Will you help? Of course, even the most strapped of us has a quarter for a hungry person. So I gave. I always do. I know it is quite possible the reasons were ploys to get money for other things, but I cannot stand the other possibility, which is that the need was actual and dire. God, you're going to hate me for doing this early. Where does this beautiful sensibility come from? If I were assigning one of my students to do the John Freeman profile, I might whisper in his or her ear, find out who his parents were. Is that part of the answer?
I think compassion exists in all of us. It's a capacity that I think defines humanity. And there's structures of life that chip away at encourage you to believe that compassion is weakness, or that compassion is not a intellectual capacity, that compassion is a luxury. This was a big part of our political dialogue in the last 50 years, that we are, the economy is too important to be driven by compassion, because obviously there are other reasons for people's need, and I think compassion was taught all around me. I guess I was lucky in that I had people who practiced it, and I to me the one of the most incredible compassion contagions is literature, because it only functions if you imagine someone else. there is no book that's a mirror. You know, even if the characters like you, even if they have the same name as you, and believe me, there's another John Freeman who's a poet. He's a Welsh guy. He keeps winning awards, the bastard. So I've read his work, great prose poems. But seriously, I think that was part of my upbringing, and my parents were both social workers, and they believed that.
I knew that this was the part of the answer. It had to be.
Well, I mean, there is another side of social work to some degree, and that's the socialization of structuring care in America that can often lead to prisons of conception about who a person is, what place they have in life. And so I say this with a lot of awareness that there are people, maybe even here, who've had that other experience. The social worker who's patronizing, the social worker in whom generosity is a weapon rather than a hand. And it's always a careful making moment when you talk about generosity, because it's about power too. You can't detach generosity from power. There's a guy in my neighborhood who sleeps on the street, and who has excuse my language here, it's not that bad. He says, you can call 311 on my ass, on the outside of his tent. But you know, my parents, I think I was never a client of theirs, but my mother was a social worker to hospice patients. There were people dying. So she had early AIDS patients in the 80s who had a lot of shame, who sometimes weren't with their families, who were angry at what was happening to them. And so her job was to be an advocate for suffering, you know, because in some cases, no one saw the people who were dying, because at that time, Dr. Fauci was also involved in this time period. But the official lines in many cases about HIV and what was then eventually called AIDS it was the sufferer's fault. So I learned through, it was a very diligent job that she had. I didn't see her do her job, but I saw her do all the paperwork for her job, which was endless. So she would come home around 4 and be so tired, my mom, from talking to people who had immense things in front of them that they were suffering at the end of their lives, at the end of their partners or lovers or sons or brother's life. And then she would be so tired she'd fall asleep. She would go to her bedroom and then take a short nap and then come out, talk to us, make dinner, because this was the 80s. And I can't excuse myself for not offering. And then we would watch TV, and then she would work from 7 until 1 or 8 until 1, transcribing her patient notes. And we never sat there and talked about it. I didn't say she did tell me about certain patients in ways that probably broke the HIPAA oath. But I was an 11-year-old. What was I going to do? Be like, Leonard's not taking the steroids. But basically it was all example.
Which was I going to say, that old thing, it's not what we are telling our children, it's what our children are watching us do. And so much humility and compassion and sense of social justice is running through the talk already this evening. But I, go back to those 2 beautiful poems he wrote. Rather than preach at us, and this book is nothing but beautiful feeling stories of what is it like to be there, or what is it like to be you. So, John, I made a note to myself the other night that it seems, I read from the back, America is broken, and that's from his introduction. He's unafraid to use the word brokenness, as if it's inherent as if brokenness is inherent in the experience of being human. but it is what you do with that brokenness. I keep thinking of that line from Hemingway in A Farewell to Arms. The world breaks everyone, and afterwards some are strong at the broken places. This is a beautiful book. It's for sale in the back, Tales of Two Americas. And so, yes, there was Tales of Two Cities, Tales of Two Americas, and the most recent one in 2020 was Tales of Two Planets. And that is about the climate crisis that we're in. And rather than preach statistics at us about how we're all going to doom, he summoned, he rounded up the best writers in the world that he could find. And I should stress that because one of John's many geniuses, he's got his fingers on the best Argentinian and Brazilian and Swiss and Middle Eastern writers. I can't keep up with U.S. writers, and John has such an international cast to his sense of what is the really beautiful piece of literature that I can assemble collaboratively. That was his word, between two covers. I'll just move on to another book quickly. We can talk about this one. I think John is very, very proud of this one. He co-edited this one with the great poet, Pulitzer winner poet, Tracy K. Smith. It's called There's a Revolution Outside, My Love. It's the same sort of idea, and this one is a little more pointed because it flows out of COVID-19, the protests that erupted in the summer of 2020 over the constant brutality against Black Americans. So he did the same thing, and oh my gosh, I just opened, here's Edwidge Danticat, the great Haitian-American novelist. Her piece is called Mourning, not as in daytime, but as Mourning. And a couple of sentences from Edwidge Danticat. It's hard to figure out how to mourn during a pandemic. Our mourning rituals have all been disrupted or taken away. The home visits, the festive wakes, the funerals, and post-burial repasts. It's such a rhetorical question, but what prompted you guys, you and Tracy K. Smith? I mean, how did you get the contributors?
This was a fascinating project to work on because it didn't begin as a book. It began as what was going to be a series for Literary Hub. After George Floyd was murdered, I wanted something other than a hot take, because it was obvious, because we all watched the video, what had happened, and I wanted to create a space that wasn't distorted by my whiteness, and so that I didn't need Black writers to explain to me what had been happening for decades, if not centuries. And I also wanted a format in which the sounds of intimacy and meditation and grief and anger could be part of it. And one of the reasons I'm so happy to be here is I feel like we've all missed collective spaces, and they don't exist in the same way if we're not together in person. And, I'm a big fan of, newspapers as metaphorical collective spaces. The internet can be sometimes a good collective space, but we need that so you can see body language and eye contact and all the other elements of communication. That we have all these various interfaces, and we haven't been able to use them. So to me, the one format that used that well, that could travel over distance, was a letter. And so I, right after Floyd was murdered, I wrote to a poet who I know named Honoré Fanon Jeffers, who had a big novel that came out last year called Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois, and that book was almost finished. And I just asked her to write me a letter from Oklahoma. And you in your Frank Lloyd Wright biography, you have an astonishing passage on the firebombing of Tulsa and and the terrible events that happened there. And so I wanted to start from some place that also had a deep-seated sense of how bad things have been and how quickly they were forgotten. And as soon as Ani, as I know her, wrote this letter, I thought there should be another person from another place. And she wrote it to me, and we published it on LitHub as Dear John. And I feel like there are times when a letter can be the most intimate thing, and you know this from Ta-Nehisi Coates' book and Imani Perry's book to her son, that a letter can transmit feeling in a way that maybe other forms cannot, because it's speaking directly to a person. It's almost like a lyric poem. And so I quickly started talking to other people, like Philadelphia's own Major Jackson. He was up in Vermont. And I thought, what does this feel like to you, formerly of Philly, now up in Vermont? And quickly sort of added other pieces, and eventually had a kind of slate of 20 or 30 people working on it. And I thought, I need to slow down here to see what I'm going to miss, because I have my own ideas of who is where and who should be writing or who could be writing. And so I called up Tracy and I said, do you want to work on this together? And thank God she said yes. And we started talking and brainstorming, and she came up with a wonderful Alaskan poet, Christy Nami Erickson. And Tracy traveled a lot as the poet laureate, which is one of the things I slightly underestimated as in that job, because it always seemed a bit like someone running around being like, poetry is great. And for those of us who've already bought in on it, it's like, yes, it is. But there are other things that come, it's not like George Washington riding around on his horse in early America being like, see, this is what your president looks like. But there's something that happens collectively with poetry in person. And Tracy could tap into that, and writers that I didn't know, and wrote the most astonishing introduction to this book that calls back to histories that she knew far more about than I did.
A lot of the pieces in this book are literally in the form of a letter and begin, Dear John. Tracy K. Smith's contribution, she put it together and wrote the introduction, but she's got her own contribution inside the book, A Letter to Black America, Dear Black America. Randall Kennan, who lived down in North Carolina and whom I knew, great writer, Dear Ones. And the first line is, 'Tis the season for toppling Confederate monuments. This is a great book. It's a beautiful book. I think more than any living American I currently know, John Freeman owns the most books of anyone I know. Lisa Funderburg is here tonight, and a couple of years ago, Lisa put out a wonderful book a couple of years ago and got John to contribute to it. It's called Apple Tree Writers on Their Parents. Lisa got a bunch of distinguished writers to write about their parents. And John had a book party in New York, not for that book, but for another book, which I'm going to talk about in a second. And Lisa and I found ourselves in New York together at this incredible apartment, which was wall-to-wall books with ladders and my wife and I have a fair number of books in our house out in Havertown, and I was estimating on the walk up here that maybe there are 8,000 books in John Freeman's apartment. He said, Paul, I think it's closer to 15,000, and we're culling down. This is a real literary man. He shares that apartment with his partner, Nicole Araji, who is a distinguished literary agent in America. She represents Colson Whitehead and other people. But what an amazing thing to see all those. I mean, John, we were just talking about books and writers and poems today. He got here about 3:30, and I can sort of talk the talk, but I know when I'm out of my league, so to speak. Literature just oozes from John's pores. I want to, and I'm watching the clock because we want to have time for some questions. I want to show you this odd, beautiful little book. It's called Dictionary of the Undoing. Who but John Freeman would come up with the idea of rescuing, in quotes, 26 words from A to Z? Let's play a little game like I'm shuffling a deck of cards. Freeman, tell me when to stop, and I'll stop, and we'll see what letter we're on. Tell me when to stop.
Stop.
Okay, where are we? We're here. We're on the letter O. The letter O is optimism. So John is riffing on 26 words in the American language, and these are beautiful, meditative, lyrical jazz riffs. His first sentence in optimism is, "Hope is like the oxygen to optimism's fire." And he goes on from there. How did you get the idea for Dictionary of the Undoing?
Well, I mean, thank you. I guess, like everyone, I was watching language being mangled in plain sight and then used in its reduced form as a weapon with which to beat people. You know, your body isn't a vehicle for music and volume and memories. It's something to sort and blame you for. You know, the environment isn't sort of the massive multitude of life that's out there. It's this thing that we are whining about. And so I felt like the only way into addressing what was happening was to try to just focus on a few words. And I this is going to sound stupid, but I hope it's inspiring to anyone who wants to write a book. I wrote the first as a Facebook post.
Say it again.
I wrote the first one as a Facebook post. You know, and because there was just so many pornographies of violence, typically against people of color, that were being screened, and it was basically like sort of the technology in our culture's algorithm was telling us through repetition that the body was a spectacle for pain, or certain types of bodies were. And so I kind of wrote a riff about the word body,
So B for body.
B for body started.
You want to read a little B for body? Anything. Just each one seems to go about what, 4 or 5 pages?
I'll just read a few, maybe a paragraph, because and actually one of the things I came across 2 writers that really inspired me on this. One is Ross Gay, who wrote a kind of nonfiction book similar to this about delight. And he basically, I talked to him a couple of years ago when the book came out, and he said, I basically sat down and sort of forced myself to write a piece in one sitting. And I realized that what if I did that in 30 days? Like every day I woke up and I wrote a letter. And the rule I made for myself was that each letter would have to use the previous letters. So A is agitate, and that's included in body, and C is citizen, that includes agitate and body. D is decency, that, you know, you can get the idea. And it's a sort of, it's an abecedarian, which is a poetic term, you know, but it's also I think form liberates us to some degree. Form doesn't restrict us; it allows us to find the capacities and the capaciousness that exists within language. So this is just how I started body. We only get one. That's why it has such power, be it large or small, freckled or tinted by the sun, black, brown, or white. Your body, in a world of endlessness, is the end of you. It's where you becomes me. We formulate this translation daily inside ourselves, taking in how the world sees us or addresses us, and then speaking back with that muscle in our mouth, the flex of our eyes, the tension that curls the lips without making a sound. We create ourselves in the improvisations of address and with the many things we do with our bodies, agitating our vocal cords, see, agitate, to make a sound. Oppressive power wants to end that choice of what to do with our bodies, how we speak with them. It wants to pulverize that agency. To do this, oppressive power has to control the body, reduce it, flatten it. You are you, it says, and I will tell you what you are meant to do.
I want to open up the room to questions. I just want to read a line from one of the reviews of all of these books. I'm a great collector of John Freeman books, and as I said at the outset, they've been translated into 20 languages, and there are 10 books at the moment that he's edited or written, and an 11th, a new book of poetry is coming in the fall called Wind Trees. But one of the reviews said this, and to me, this sentence seems to stand for everything we've been talking about, everything that he is trying to do for us, help us with in literature. Urgent, worthy reportage from our fractious, volatile, social, and cultural moment. Somebody out there will ask John a beautiful question. Yes, ma'am.
Why poetry?
This is my student Elaine. Elaine, I didn't see you there. Thank you, Elaine, from 10 or 12 years ago. You don't have the world record, but you always come to these events. Thank you, Elaine. What is the question?
The question was why poetry? Like, why this particular medium?
That's a good question. I for the students from St. Joe's, when I was a junior in Sacramento, California, in a much less nice school than St. Joe's, I once took my girlfriend there, and she wouldn't get out of the car, and she's from Lebanon, and lived through the Civil War. But I had beautiful English teachers, and I took some great classes there, and we had a poet come to our class, this poet Gary Soto. And it made the world of difference to me to realize that using words could be if not a life, then it could be a lifelong possession. And the poems that we wrote in class that day and the way that he treated us as if what we were doing was serious made me realize that that making someone feel something is serious business. And the only thing I would change to Paul's elegant sign-off there was I'm not doing this for anyone. I'm doing this with everyone. And I think there is maybe I'm going to sound very Californian here, but I think that one of the best things that we can do is make each other feel something serious and real. And I think poetry operates fundamentally in the body because it's meant to be spoken, is written to be spoken mostly. You use your tongue, which is a muscle, and you produce sound, which works in your ear, and so it's basically it turns the body into a bell that it strikes if it works well. And sometimes it doesn't ring based on sense or rational sense. You read a poem, you think, I don't know what that means, but I'm feeling something from it. And to me, that's a very powerful, almost holy art. And I think something happens when you're reading something on the page and it produces a physical reaction. And I think it connects us to the past. It connects us to an imagined other. And it makes, I think, the use of language seem like something glorious and pleasurable. Because hopefully if a poem is making you feel something, it also is bringing you some form of complicated pleasure, even if that's in the pain of another or in the sweet reminder of what loss can feel like, or in just simply describing a place that maybe reminds you of another place that helps you imagine the place on the page.
I think John was just writing a poem there, wasn't he? When he said, the body is a bell that strikes. Somebody ask another question.
I just first off wanted to thank you so much for your time here, and I think this is a question more geared towards maybe members of our younger audience who are interested in entering the publishing industry or interested in editorial. I guess just wanted to get a quick capture of like how you got started, what inspired you, and also any advice you have for anyone who's interested in going into publishing or just being a writer, the struggles and also the joys of that.
Yeah, my biography sounds really fancy, but as I mentioned, I'm from Sacramento. I grew up delivering newspapers. I never thought I would even get to work on a newspaper. And I already kind of gave up on that when I was young. I went to Swarthmore down the road, which at the time was not cranking out creative artists. It was like, you will use your rational capacities to create frameworks for understanding the knowledge of the world, and you will use an Excel spreadsheet in which to crunch the numbers that need to be there so you can create policies which will make the world better. So I failed my statistics class at Swarthmore. And that sort of enabled me to embrace the English major that I was sort of keeping in abeyance in case I flunked it, and I did. So my senior year, I don't know if anyone here is a senior or junior. I got to April of my senior year. I had no job. I had a half-assed major, and I had no idea what I wanted to do because I had done all of my other internships as if I was going to work at a think tank. I'd gone and I'd interned at a lobbying group for health policy, politics, and law in Sacramento, which was a laugh a minute. So I had no idea. And a recruiter came to campus from Bantam Doubleday Dell, which is sort of the smaller corporation that's now Penguin Random House. It's one part of it. And they were recruiting for editorial assistant jobs right out of college, which is very unusual. And I was, I had been the editor of school paper at Swarthmore, and I could write, but I didn't know what publishers were. I had no idea that there was a publishing industry. I mean, I knew books were published by publishers, but I had no concept in my mind that there was an editor there making changes, or literary agents, or I knew what book reviews were because I worked in the library and read the New York Times Book Review. So my advice to you is to not do what I did, which is to pre-restrict your own dreams, and to look around at the entry points to the publishing industry. So every publishing company has editorial assistants who are basically, how would I describe this? They're basically handling the manuscript at every stage of the production cycle and keeping things on track and keeping the input-output of an editorial office somewhat organized. I get 100 submissions a week, and I couldn't keep track of that if I wasn't working with an assistant. It was like, oh, you need to respond to this person. But Sarah, the person I work with, who's a recent graduate from Duke, does all sorts of other things, basically. Checks the copy at every stage to make sure no errors have crept in on the outside of books. There are many, many, many places in which, if you care about reading, if you care about books, if you're kind of a book nerd, if you get lost into bookstores and your friends have to come and drag you out and be like, we have another part of our day which doesn't involve what you're doing in this bookstore, there are places for you. You could read for scouting agencies. You can read for film companies. You can work at magazines. You can work at newspapers. And as much as these industries have shrunk, especially newspapers, they still need people. They're desperate for smart people. And when I started my job, the editor that I shared the editorial assistant with, who's actually John's editor, his assistant left, so we had to hire a new assistant. And there were some good candidates, but not nearly as many as I thought. And so some things that you can do to help yourself if you're starting out is do a few internships. Look around. There's internships at every single magazine and every single publishing house, every newspaper and every small newspaper, every literary magazine. And if they don't have one, you can write to them and be like, listen, I created an internship at the Philadelphia Museum of Art when I thought I wanted to be a curator, and then I realized you had to have 7 languages. I thought, all right, not going to do that one. So a tiny bit of cold calling and writing to people can go such a long way. And all of us, I mean, like I said, my biography might sound grand, but I'm still the person in Sacramento who's delivering newspapers in my head, who's thinking, I'm just going to live here and maybe work at the library, and that would be a great life,
I'm struck by that John has achieved what he's achieved with this fundamental modesty and this concern for other people, to be other directed. I'll just read one more tribute to one of his books, How to Be Good in Bad Times, How to Speak Truth, Why Read, Why Write, Why Bother. We're lucky that John Freeman is out there looking for some answers. Language is his primary concern. He showed us that tonight.
Can I say one last thing?
Sure.
The last thing I'll say to your question, which possesses me, because I believe, not really, but in the multiverse, that there's the me that didn't go to the job interview at Bantam Doubleday Dell and that, is doing something else. I worked at an investment bank for a while. That was terrible. But that doesn't say that's a bad job. It just, for me, it would have been a death. And I think one of the things that really helped me is the realization that collaboration was a way forward. Carlin was never my editor at the Philadelphia Inquirer, but I learned a lot from Frank Wilson, who worked there. I collaborated with all the editors I ever got to work with, and I wish I'd known earlier that I could have collaborated my way into publishing. Making anthologies is an incredibly rewarding task, and there are lots and lots of spaces that are not curated within literature that will probably be more obvious to some of you who are younger than us two, and that you could probably make an anthology about. You can start a magazine now with very little money because you can build it on the internet. You can start a publication, and that if you go to the centers of publishing and they say no, which they did to me. I interviewed at the New Yorker and they were like, no, and go away. You can start your own place. You can build your own spaceship. And the New Yorker began that way in the 20s or 30s when a couple people from Ohio were like, let's make a metropolitan magazine. And, the publications then were not treating them seriously. The New York Review, which is now a grand publication, began that way too, when people weren't paying enough attention to criticism. So this is not a static world of zero sum. I think the thing I can tell you most, I want anyone who's a student here, is that your success will not come at the expense of someone else if you work together. And I think if you find ways to work together, it will make you feel a little less alone. It will make it more fun. And you'll probably learn things you never set out to know.
We try not to go too much past an hour. So before we give a big round of applause, I'll just say that there is a reception in the other room, and John will be willing to bump your elbow or shake your hand and sign some books. Would you please give a good round of applause? Thank you very much.
Thanks.